We're joined by the Finance Minister Mathias Cormann live out of WA. Thanks for being with us at the early hours of the morning over there in Perth. Minister, let me ask you straight off the bat about the, I guess, the financial update that yourself and Joe Hockey released during the week. It puts the government in a bit of a catch-22, the economic climate, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, to be a good government, you do have to tighten the fiscal belt, as has been mentioned, but to not fall into political harm's way, you have to honour a whole bunch of pretty big spending election commitments. How do you do both?
Well, firstly, our overarching objective is to build a stronger economy and create more jobs. And of course, if you build a stronger economy, not only does that improve the national prosperity, but it also increases revenue for government. What we've inherited from the Labor Party is an economy which is growing below trend, unemployment which is rising, cautious consumers and business investment that has plateaued. After 6 years of adding more and more burdens onto the Australian economy, with the carbon tax, the mining tax, more than 21,000 new pieces of red tape at a time when the global economic environment was already pretty challenging, was clearly the wrong way to go. And this government will, change direction so that we can take some of those burdens off and strengthen economic growth. On the flip side, of course, there's no doubt that we will have to reassess which areas of government spending are still appropriate and where there are improvements for increased efficiencies and savings.
But can I ask, Minister, you say you'll have to reassess some areas of spending. You won't presumably be able to or want to reassess some of those areas of big spending which were election commitments. So we're talking about multi-billion-dollar commitments in terms of paid parental leave, direct action, a host of other areas as well. None of that is up for grabs, though, is it? You're only able to look at those parts of the budget where those election spending promises weren't made.
If your question is whether we will stick to our election commitments, yes, absolutely. But I just remind you that in our pre-election costings document, you would have been able to see that our policies and our savings measures actually improve the budget bottom line. We not only presented a whole series of policy commitments, but we also presented about $42 billion worth of savings, all but one of which have been reflected in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, which we released earlier this week.
But can I ask, it's a fairly simple question. If the economic situation, as per the update this week, has changed so dramatically, then it is reasonable, it has changed the economic fundamentals so dramatically, then it's entirely reasonable, isn't it, that a newly minted government is allowed to take a fresh look at commitments that it made ahead of the election, because circumstances have changed, and when the facts change, you have to change your reaction, surely.
Well, I say to you again, the commitments together with the savings that we took to the last election actually improved the budget bottom line. And the economic fundamentals haven't changed to the same extent as we have made a more realistic assessment of those economic fundamentals in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook. What we have done, I mean, the previous government invariably took an overly optimistic view of where things would go. They always overestimated revenue. They invariably underestimated expenditure, and from budget to budget update, the budget position continued to deteriorate. What we've sought to do in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook is present the true position of the budget based on realistic, believable assumptions which will withstand the test of time.
Okay, let's just talk about the future, Minister. Are 10 years of budget deficits intolerable for you and for the Abbott government?
Indeed it is. Our commitment is to return the budget to surplus as soon as possible. What we've presented earlier in the week is the position that we've inherited, the debt trajectory that we've inherited without corrective action. We are committed to corrective action. We're committed to bring the budget back onto a believable pathway to surplus as soon as possible.
Well, can I just ask you then, seeing you're the Finance Minister, you're the Minister responsible for spending overall, how significant over time will be the spending cuts and spending adjustment required?
Well, I mean, obviously we're working our way now towards our first budget in May.
But what's your message? What's your message on this? How significant are the spending cuts required?
Well, our message on this is that we're going through an orderly, methodical and careful process. We've taken $42 billion worth of savings to the last election, which we're implementing. We've found another $1.1 billion worth of savings that we reflected in my E4 on top of that. Now we've got the Commission of Audit, which is looking right across government, reviewing the scope, the size and the efficiency of government with the view of making recommendations to us on adjustments that can be made moving forward, so that over time and as soon as possible we can put the budget back into a surplus position that is sustainable into the future. I'm not going to give you our May budget today, Paul, but what I can say to you is that we're totally committed to bring the budget back to surplus as soon as possible.
Well, look, I find that answer puzzling given the magnitude of the challenge outlined in the mid-year review. So can I ask it another way? Do you think that Australians at the moment are living beyond their means?
Well, clearly the government right now is living beyond its means. The government, over the 6 years of Labor, the government has spent $314 billion more than they raised in revenue. We're spending $123 billion more than we've raised in revenue, than we're expected to raise in revenue over the current forward estimates. So clearly the government is living beyond its means. That is not a situation that is sustainable, and that is a situation that we are committed to correct. But we're going to do it in a calm, methodical and careful fashion.
Okay, well look, let's just try and proceed a bit more with this. The review makes it clear that on a no policy change basis, spending is going to be increasing about 3.7% annually. Labor pledged to restrain that to 2%. What sort of target is realistic for the Abbott government?
Well, again, I mean, I'm not going to lock myself into the parameters that we will be putting forward at budget time. I mean,
but it's not about locking you into parameters, Minister. It's about what sort of a target you would like to set. You're not setting it in stone, but you must have some idea as the Minister responsible where you would roughly like to head.
Peter, if I were to make a pronouncement here today, believe you me, that would be setting it in stone. What I'm doing is the responsible thing. We are going through an orderly, careful, methodical process. We'll be making some announcements between now and budget time about some of our fiscal targets and the rules that we'll intend to operate within. These are obviously the considerations that we're working our way through right as we speak. But I just stress again, though, everybody that asks me questions about this always just exclusively focuses on the spending side, and the spending side is indeed important, but our commitment is to strengthen economic growth, which will have a beneficial impact on the revenue side. So we've got to do both. We've got to grow the economy, which leads to increased revenue without the need for more taxes, as well as focusing on the expenditure side.
But let's call a spade here, Minister. I mean, what you are doing is deliberately reducing expectations to be able to then rise above them. You look at the forward estimates, you've got a situation where you've bumped up spending growth to over 3.5%. You've knocked down economic growth to 2% or thereabouts in these forward estimates. And as a result, you're painting a dire picture, which you can then turn around when the economy actually meets trend, or when growth actually meets what it was in the last year of Labor rather than in the previous 5 and is well below 3.5%, you're going to have a scenario where you're going to be able to say, just simply because of getting those forward estimates where you want them, you're going to be able to say your economic management has brought it all back under control.
Well, Peter, I completely reject that. And if you look at the document, you'll actually see the evidence against that assertion that you've just made. Our estimates are based on the consensus view on where the economy is at and where the economy is trending. I mean, and in fact, we've got a graph published in the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook, which shows that essentially our forecasts and our economic forecasts are the middle of the road in terms of the consensus view of economic analysts on where the economy is at. The problem, I mean, if your question is your assessment more conservative than the previous government's assessment, then the answer to that would be yes. But our view very much is the consensus view.
That's because it's two sides of the same coin. Labor always wanted to act like there was a surplus on the horizon, so they would always make it look like their spending was going to be more under control and economic growth was greater than it turned out to be. You're doing the flip side because you're a new government. We've had an amount of Labor debt. They've fallen short on where they needed to on the budget. So it suits you to be able to say economic growth is low and spending will be high unless we pull it under control. And then voila, 6 years from now you'll say we pulled it under control. We delivered a surplus sooner than Labor would have. It would have been a decade under them. But it's all just smoke and mirrors, isn't it?
No, well, Peter, you can't have it both ways. I mean, if you agree with me that the previous government was overly optimistic in their estimates, that they overestimated economic growth forecasts, that they overestimated revenue estimates, and that they underestimated where the expenditure was going, then you can't criticise us for having decided to work on the basis of more realistic.
Well, my criticism is you've gone too far the other way. They were black, you were white. You could have gone grey.
Well, I mean, and we have gone middle of the road. I mean, I encourage you to look at the discussion in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook around the consensus estimates about economic growth and various economic trends moving forward, and you'll find that we're right in the middle of what are the consensus estimates.
Given the difficulty of this situation, Minister, do you rule out increases in taxation at all, any increases in tax rates in order to try and repair the budget?
Look, I mean, again, our commitment is to lower taxes because we want to grow the economy more strongly.
That's why I've asked the question.
Yeah, sure. And our commitment is to scrap the carbon tax, to scrap the mining tax, to reduce company tax rates by 1.5%. But I mean, again, I'm not going to give you blanket statements in relation to the budget which is going to come out in May. But I mean, our election commitments are there for all to see, and we've already said that we'll stick to our election commitments.
Paul Kelly asked you earlier in the interview about whether or not you thought that people were living beyond their means, and you made the point that the government has certainly been living beyond its means. When you look at private debt, though, to bring you back to the question, private debt has long been higher in this country and more of an issue than public debt. So do you think individuals like the government are also living beyond their means?
Well, I mean, all of the data would suggest that in recent years, private savings have actually gone up, and so I mean, which obviously was a trend that was particularly accentuated post the global financial crisis. I mean, obviously, our primary concern in the job that I've got and that I'm focused on right now is to make sure that government lives within its means, and obviously the situation that we've inherited was particularly bad on that front.
We're talking to the Finance Minister, Senator Mathias Cormann. We're going to take a break here on Australian Agenda. When we come back, we'll continue to discuss the budget update, but also the disability support pension is in the headlines because the government wants to reform it. Most of us would say that's long overdue. Back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where Paul Kelly and I are speaking to the Finance Minister, who's joining us live out of Perth, Mathias Cormann. Senator Cormann, the disability support pension, most of us would say that it's in urgent need of reform. We're coming up on about 1 million people in the years ahead that will be on it. One of the problems with being on it, of course, as opposed to unemployment benefits, is not just that its rate is substantially higher, but also it doesn't have a requirement in there that you be looking for work. I don't want our viewers to think that I'm anti-reforming DSP, because I'm not, but one question that really needs to be asked is, if you are going to look at reforming this huge black hole of government spending, how do you do it in a way where you ensure that genuine recipients of the DSP don't get caught up in compliance and the like, which affects their genuine right to be on it when you're trying to, in a sense, move other people off it that perhaps shouldn't be on it?
Well, and that is obviously the objective. So, I mean, right now we're looking right across government for opportunities to improve efficiencies, to reduce costs in a sensible fashion. This is one of the fast-growing areas of government expenditure. And the objective, of course, is to ensure that those in genuine need receive the appropriate levels of support, but that people who are able to work are encouraged to go back to work. So, I mean, these are the sorts of discussions we're having having at the moment, and of course the Commission of Audit is looking at this whole area for us as well, and is expected to make some recommendations to us on how that can best be achieved by the end of January.
Would you say that on sort of your look at it to date, and I accept that there'll be more looking into it obviously going forward early next year, but your first look at it, the DSP, reforming DSP, would that be one of the key areas where the government can rein in costs and therefore be able to do something about debt?
Well, it is one of the areas where we think that there is an opportunity for reform, that's for sure. And I mean, and of course, I mean, we think that there's an opportunity here for a win-win. Obviously, only those people who genuinely need disability service pension support should be getting it. And our view is that anyone who can work should work. And of course, the disability services pension arrangements should facilitate that.
Minister, we have the results from some of the pilot programs for the National Disability Insurance Scheme showing that some of the package costs are running 30% above expectations. How concerned are you about that, and how concerned are you about the broader funding for the insurance scheme?
Well, the first point I'd make is that we're totally committed to deliver the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It always has been a bipartisan commitment and will continue to be a bipartisan commitment, I'm sure. So, in terms of like the Labour Party, no doubt will continue to support it too. Now, when it comes to costs, I mean, this is a relatively new scheme. As you say, it is only just starting. There's some trials that have been underway, and you know, the way these sorts of things normally work is that once you trial something, you try and get learnings out of that, and you try to make judgments on how you can things better to make sure that these services and these benefits are delivered in the most efficient, cost-effective way.
But if it's running, Minister, if it's running 30% over budget in some areas, that is going to be an enormous strain on the budget when it's rolled out more widely. What sort of things can you do to put the meat on the bones of that? What can you actually do to try to rein in costs as you watch this in a trial sense?
Well, and these are the conversations that Mitch Fifield, the Minister with responsibility at a federal level for this area, is having with state and territory governments and with a number of other stakeholders. Our commitment is to deliver the scheme, but our commitment also is to deliver it in the most efficient, cost-effective way. And I mean, I saw some people, in particular from the Labor side, critical of those comments that the Treasurer and I made earlier in the week. But I mean, what is the alternative to deliver the scheme in an inefficient and wasteful way rather than in an efficient and cost-effective way? I mean, look, I mean, this is very early days. This is a very new scheme. It's going to be important to get this scheme right, and it's important to put it on a fiscally sustainable setting. That's what we're committed to do. We're having these conversations, obviously, within government, and the responsible minister is having these conversations with all of the relevant stakeholders as we speak.
In terms of your approach to spending, is everything on the table? Welfare, health, education spending? Will you be reviewing the lot?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, everything is on the table to the extent that the Commission of Audit has been asked to look right across government with a view of maximising the efficiencies and ensuring that the operations of government are as efficient as possible. Having said that, obviously we've made some commitments in the lead up to the last election which we'll stick to. For example, that there won't be any cuts to health, education and defence spending, which doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't improve the quality of the spend within the funding envelope for health, education and defence. So we would still expect the Commission of Audit to make recommendations to us on how efficiencies can be achieved within health, education and defence. But obviously the way the government would implement those recommendations would be consistent with the commitments we took to the last election, which is that we would not be reducing the funding envelope. And indeed, in relation to defence, our commitment is over the decade to take that funding envelope to 2% of GDP.
How concerned are you as Finance Minister with these demands coming all the time now from various companies for government subsidies, government bailouts? SPC Arbona is the most recent one. What's your response to this?
Well, I mean, I guess, like, in a way, you ought to be assessing these things on a case-by-case basis. I mean, the general point I would make is that if an industry or if a particular business doesn't have a future without ongoing subsidies, then really it doesn't have a future. I mean, there is a place for government support, taxpayer support, for well-targeted, time-limited support through a structural or transitional adjustment. But obviously, if you can't stand on your own 2 feet, if you're not commercially viable at any time into the future without taxpayer support, then really there's got to be a serious question asked whether you have any future at all.
Well, some of these companies clearly do have difficulties or have had difficulties, and we've seen, like in the case of Holden, that they're not going to continue their operations in Australia. But other companies that have started to put their hand out and ask for government subsidies, it feels a little bit, doesn't it, like they're trying to hold the government to ransom. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, the government is not going to be held to ransom at any point. Our commitment, again, I go back to where I started, our commitment is to build a stronger, more prosperous economy where businesses can be successful because the overall settings and the environment is right. And of course, that's why we are committed to scrap the carbon tax, scrap the mining tax, reduce red tape, achieve $1 billion worth of savings per annum for business from lower compliance costs. And that's why we're investing in the roads of the 21st century, like productivity enhancing infrastructure. But you know, obviously, in a private sector, business should be able to survive on the basis of its good management and its initiative and the fact that they've got something to offer that people want to buy.
You mentioned that in terms of government subsidies, you know, decisions obviously need to be made on a case-by-case basis, but there must also be overarching principles. What are they? What are the overarching principles about when a business might be deemed eligible for government support versus when it might not? Does it just fundamentally come down to if it's not viable without government subsidy, then it's not eligible for it because we live in a market system?
Well, again, I mean, the principle, I mean, in a high-level way that I've just mentioned is that, you know, obviously there are going to be occasions where, because of circumstances, there might be the need for time-limited, well-targeted, transitional support because you can see that there's light at the end of the tunnel and there's just a set of circumstances at a particular point in time, which means that a particular company or particular industry is in difficulty, but you can see that that is not going to be forever. But if you're going to be in a circumstance where without taxpayer-funded support, you are never going to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, then really you've got to ask yourself the question whether that is an appropriate way to deploy the limited resources made available to us by taxpayers.
How keen are you to review the renewable energy target?
Well, in the normal course of events, the renewable energy target is due for review in 2007, which I'm sure you're aware of. I mean, clearly the cost of energy is one of the cost drivers which has reduced our international competitiveness in recent years. So, in particular, the carbon tax has been pushing up the cost of electricity, which has pushed up the cost of doing business, which has made us less competitive internationally. And there's no doubt that the renewable energy target also has had an impact on our international competitiveness. So
should it have to change, do you believe? Should something change?
Well,
your coalition partners, the Nationals in particular, take a pretty strong view on this.
Well, as I've just said, there is a review in the normal course of events which is due to take place in 2014. That review will take place. I'm not going to preempt the findings of the review, but obviously if you're having a look at something, you're going to have to be reasonably open-minded as to how you're going to deal with any recommendations that come out of that review.
What's the justification for seeking the abolition of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, seeing it costs you money?
Well, again, I mean, I think that people are quoting some numbers out of context here. You've got to remember, the previous government decided to borrow $10 billion in order to give them to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation then to start writing some loans. Firstly, I mean, I'm always suspicious about government being involved in banking. This particular government-run bank has been in business for less than 6 months, and so anyone who makes judgment on how successful or unsuccessful they'll be over the medium to long term, I think are getting ahead of themselves. But secondly, those that have asserted that it makes us money do not take into account the cost of funds, the fact that the government has got to pay interest on the debt that we are incurring in order to supply the Clean Energy Finance Corporation with funds, with capital. And I mean, in a philosophical sense, either the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is investing in projects that are too risky and where funds will be at risk, and then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why should the taxpayer be exposed to that risk? Or they are investing, as they assert, in commercially viable and at a commercial rate of return. And then you've got to ask yourself the question, well, why should the government be competing with the private sector?
So in other words,
if the projects that
So in other words, your real opposition is a philosophical opposition. You've just got a generic hostility to this concept.
Well, it's not just philosophical. If you look at Australian political history at a state and at a federal level, I mean, you know, governments are not that good at running banks. And I know that people are getting themselves excited about the performance of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation over less than 6 months. But I mean, right now, the trajectory that Labor has put us on at a time when we are already facing a $47 billion deficit, $123 billion worth of deficits over the forward estimates, and $667 billion worth of debt, the Labor Party put us on a trajectory where we had to borrow $10 billion so we can put it into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which of course increases the level of interest that we've got to pay. It increases the cost for government. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation doesn't take that into account when they assess their financial performance. So the numbers that you're quoting there to me are based on their assessment in isolation of the cost of funds. And obviously we haven't got that luxury of assessing performance in isolation of the cost of funds.
In the same week that the Treasurer said that the government needs to tighten its belt because there is a spending problem, George Brandis, the Attorney General, appointed a new Human Rights Commissioner at a salary no less of $320,000 per year. The commission to run it costs in excess of $25 million a year. Why on earth wouldn't the coalition just abolish the whole thing and save the money?
Well, firstly, if there's going to be a Human Rights Commission, then Tim Wilson's appointment was an outstanding appointment. He'll do a great job.
But why is there one? I guess that's the main question.
He'll help restore some balance to that particular organisation over the medium to long term. Let's just watch this space and see what happens.
You think it could be on the chopping block sooner rather than later?
I'm not going to preempt any findings.
Well, you've already preempted it. You said, watch this space. Something must be about to happen.
I said, no. I mean, again, I said in terms of what might or might not happen is what I said. In terms of what might or might not happen over the medium to long term, let's watch this space. But you know, right now there is a Human Rights Commission, and Tim Wilson is an inspired and outstanding appointment to that commission.
Can I ask you about the Audit Commission, taking a bit of a look at government spending? Now, I'm asking you to play political commentator a little bit here, but what's the do what you can for me,
Not
please.
Gonna do that.
What's the yardstick for government success in terms of what it does or doesn't adopt from this commission? Because obviously you'll take some of it and you won't take other things. Even Peter Costello's first budget didn't take everything that came out of their Audit Commission look at things. Where's the yardstick, would you say?
Well, I mean, as we've said on the record on a number of occasions, I mean, we want the Commission of Audit to look at everything right across government, but the government obviously at the end of the day will have to make judgments on which recommendations we will and which recommendations we will not accept, and the yardstick for that will be the commitments we took to the last election. We will not be implementing recommendations in a way that would be inconsistent with the commitments we took to the last election.
Given the situation with debt and deficits, what on earth is the ongoing justification for Tony Abbott's paid parental leave scheme, apart from the fact that he promised it at the election? Apart from that particular provision, is there any other justification for this sort of scale of it?
Well, we're not just doing this like as a bit of symbolism. I mean, the paid parental leave scheme is an important economic reform. It is part of our plan to build a stronger economy and create more jobs. The paid parental leave scheme is designed to increase workforce participation, to increase productivity, and to encourage increases in population.
Is the government united in that view? I mean, are the backbench 100% behind the executive on this, in your opinion?
Well, it's a policy we took to the last election. It is a policy the government is committed to, and it is a policy that we will put to the Parliament with a view of having it legislated. Obviously, I mean, the deadline for implementation is 1 July 2015, and we are furiously working to implement that very important commitment.
But is there a risk in the Senate in particular? I'm thinking the Liberal Party likes to spruik that, unlike Labor, it doesn't bind its backbenchers to a party vote. People can vote on their conscience, they can cross the floor. I, for one, can't imagine someone like Senator Cory Bernardi voting for the paid parental leave scheme. Can you envisage any scenario where Liberals cross the floor on this totemic issue?
You're now asking me to well and truly be a commentator and to start engaging in hypotheticals, which I won't do. All I can say to you is that the government remains totally committed to this very important economic reform, that we will put it to the Parliament in the form that we took it to the last election, and then obviously we'll have to work through the parliamentary processes with a view of getting the best possible outcome at the other end.
Senator, you've been generous with your time. One more question before we let you go. The unemployment rate, the projections of what you put out during the week are that it will go up. Are you comfortable as a government fighting the next election as a government that has presided over higher unemployment than when it took office?
Well, when we last were in government, so when Labor got elected, the unemployment rate had a 4 in front of it. And of course, I mean, the situation we've inherited is, as I've said earlier, the economy growing below trend and unemployment rising. Now, what we've done in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, going back to the assumptions that we've used, is we have made a more realistic assessment of where things are likely to be over the forward estimates. The previous government, the Labor Party, essentially assumed that in the final 2 years of the forward estimates, the unemployment rate would go back to the long-term average of 5%. So the practical effect of that is that on 30 June 2015, supposedly, the unemployment rate was 6.25%, and that by 1 July 2015 and the 2 years following, the unemployment rate would miraculously drop down to 5%. That was a technical assumption they used, which of course then had flow-on implications all throughout the budget in terms of lower expenditure and higher income, which artificially helped them create the impression of a surplus in 2016-17. What we've done is we've said, well, that is not realistic. Our objective is to grow the economy more strongly, to create more jobs, and as we are successful in implementing our plans to achieve that, we will of course make adjustments along the way. But in the meantime, we think it is more realistic to assume that the unemployment rate at a time of below trend economic growth is going to remain at that sort of level rather than to drop off sharply outside of any lifts in economic growth.
Senator Mathias Cormann, the Finance Minister in Tony Abbott's government, thanks for making yourself available so close to Christmas after what I know has been a particularly busy, not just week, but busy 100 days since you've been in office. We appreciate your company. Thank you.
Merry Christmas to both of you.
Hope you get a break over the New Year period.